I stood in my own doorway, hand trembling on the frame, watching my son pull away with his family, my husband's grave behind him, and me left behind like an afterthought. "You're not going," he'd said, without even looking up from his phone. 3 months since David's burial, and I was still begging for a ride. My son refused to take me to my husband's resting place, so I took back everything, from the deed to the legacy, and dug his name out of my will. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Janet stood on the porch, clutching the door frame, watching her son's face harden like a lock turning against her. The late summer air pressed heavy against her skin, cicadas droning in the trees, but inside her chest, everything had gone cold. "Eric," she said quietly, steadying her voice the way she had in front of school board members for decades. "It's been 3 months since I last went. Will you take me today?" Her son didn't even lift his eyes from his phone. 38 years old, yet somehow carrying himself with the sulking arrogance of a teenager. Eric tapped at the glowing screen as if her words were nothing more than static. "It's not a good time, Mom," he muttered, thumbs still swiping. From the kitchen came the sharp click of Monica's heels against the hardwood. She emerged crisp in a white blouse and pearls, her lips curving in something between pity and disdain. "It's depressing for Olivia," she chimed, her voice smooth as polished glass. "We don't need to drag her back there again. Funerals? Graves? It's all too much." Janet's grip tightened until her knuckles turned white. To call visiting her husband's resting place, dragging her granddaughter anywhere, Monica said it with such dismissiveness, like grief was an untidy habit. Janet straightened, drawing herself up with the quiet authority she'd never lost. "Then I'll go alone," she said firmly. That should have been the end of it. She imagined herself calling a cab, or perhaps asking the neighbor across the street. But Eric finally raised his head, gray eyes hard as stone, so like his father's in color but missing the warmth. He stepped forward, lowering his voice into that patronizing calm he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while delivering cruelty. "No, Mom," he said, final and flat. "You're not going." For a heartbeat, she couldn't process it. The words hung heavy in the foyer, thicker than the August humidity. She searched his face for humor, but there was none. He had meant it. Monica slipped her handbag onto her shoulder, glancing at her watch. "We'll be back later," she said, as if Janet were a child being left with a sitter. And just like that, they were gone. Eric, Monica, and even Olivia, who trailed behind them reluctantly. From the doorway, Janet caught the flicker of her granddaughter's eyes. Olivia's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but Eric's hand pressed firmly against her back, guiding her out. The front door closed with a sharp clap, followed by the low rumble of the SUV's engine. Janet stood rooted in place, her breath shallow, her heart stumbling. She felt the silence of the house pressing against her, a suffocating quiet broken only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Her husband, David, had been her anchor, her balance. The cemetery was the only place left where she could speak to him, even if only into the stillness. There, her voice felt heard. And now her son, her only son, had slammed that gate shut. She drifted toward the window, pulling the curtain back just in time to see their SUV rolling down the street. In the back seat, Olivia turned, her hand lifting faintly against the glass. A silent wave, a silent plea. Janet pressed her fingertips to the cool glass of her own window, but the SUV was already gone. The curtain fell back. The house groaned in the late afternoon heat. She lowered herself onto the sofa, the leather sighing beneath her weight, and folded her hands in her lap. For the first time since the funeral, her grief shifted shape. Not sorrow, not despair. Something jagged and cold settled into her bones. Resolve. Time crept forward. She brewed tea she didn't drink. She watered plants already damp. She straightened the stack of unopened mail on the side table. Each action was mechanical, as if she were acting out a life that didn't quite belong to her anymore. When darkness finally seeped into the house, shadows lengthening across the carpet. The clock seemed louder, relentless. Then, a knock. Soft, deliberate, from the back door. Janet startled, her pulse leaping. She moved across the kitchen tiles, careful with each step, and pulled aside the curtain. A figure slipped from the yard into the glow of the porch light. It was Olivia. Her granddaughter's face was pale but determined, her eyes wide with urgency. She pressed a finger to her lips, then leaned close to the glass. When Janet opened the door, Olivia whispered with fierce certainty, "Grandma, I'll take you." Janet blinked at her granddaughter's determined face, the porch light painting Olivia's features in gold and shadow. The girl's eyes glimmered with urgency, not fear, though her shoulders tensed as if she half expected Eric's SUV to reappear on the street. "Grandma," Olivia whispered again, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "I'll take you." For a moment, Janet hesitated. The risk of being caught flickered across her mind. Eric's outrage, Monica's sharp tongue, but then she remembered the hollow silence of the house earlier. The cruel finality in Eric's voice. Something inside her shifted, breaking loose. She squeezed Olivia's hand. "Let's go." The two of them moved quickly, almost conspiratorial, slipping down the steps into the heavy night. Ere the scent of cut grass lingered from a neighbor's mower, mingling with the faint tang of car exhaust. At the curb sat a dented silver sedan, too modest to belong to Eric or Monica, too familiar to be anything but borrowed. Olivia fished the keys from her pocket and gave a little shrug. "Friend from school lent it. He thinks I'm just going for ice cream." Janet's lips twitched, the closest she had come to a smile all day. "Then let's make it worth the favor." The car doors groaned as they climbed inside. The upholstery smelled faintly of fast food and cherry air freshener, a teenage boy's car through and through. Olivia adjusted the rearview mirror, her fingers trembling only slightly before she steadied them on the wheel. The engine coughed to life, headlights slicing across the quiet street. As they pulled away, Janet glanced back at her darkened house, the curtains drawn like closed eyelids. For the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a stage she had just stepped off, finally free for a scene of her own making. They drove in near silence at first, the hum of the tires on asphalt the only sound. Columbus after midnight was hushed, storefronts shuttered, traffic lights blinking on empty intersections. The moon hung low, swollen and pale, guiding them as surely as any map. Janet let her hand rest on the bouquet in her lap. White lilies and marigolds she had bought 2 days earlier, still fresh, still waiting. Her fingers brushed the cool petals, and her throat tightened. When they reached the cemetery gates, Olivia slowed the car, headlights sweeping over the wrought iron fence. The gate was locked for the night, but she pulled over to the shoulder, killing the engine. The sudden absence of sound made the world feel even more hushed. "Through here," Olivia said softly, pointing to a narrow path where the fence had a gap just wide enough to slip through. Her voice carried no hesitation. Together they moved through the opening, the night air cooler on the cemetery grounds. The grass was damp, clinging to Janet's shoes, and the scent of earth and stone filled her lungs. Owls called from somewhere high in the trees, their low hoots echoing. When they reached David Collins' grave, Janet stopped. Her knees trembled, and she gripped Olivia's arm for balance. The headstone caught the moonlight, gray and unyielding, his name carved deep into its face. She lowered herself slowly, placing the flowers against the base of the stone. Her hands shook as she arranged them, pressing the stems into the grass as though anchoring herself to the earth. Her voice, when it came, was thin and trembling. "Your father would be ashamed of him," she whispered into the night. Olivia knelt beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "So am I." The words cut sharper than Janet expected, not because they hurt, but because they carried truth. A truth spoken by the one person who still saw her clearly. She turned, hugging her granddaughter fiercely, clinging to her as though she were the last real connection she had left. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, lifting strands of Janet's hair across her face. For a long while, they stayed there together in silence, the graveyard surrounding them not with fear, but with strange serenity. When at last they walked back to the car, Janet felt lighter, not unburdened, but steadier, as though she had planted something in the ground along with those flowers. Not grief. Resolve. The drive home passed in silence, but it was not the silence of neglect. It was a silence of understanding, as though the night itself had granted them space to breathe. The house loomed dark when they returned, its windows blank, its walls waiting. Inside, Janet moved directly to the hall closet. She reached high to the top shelf, pulling down a metal lockbox that clattered softly in her hands. She carried it to the dining table, set it down, and with deliberate care, turned the dial. The lid creaked open, revealing manila folders, legal papers, and envelopes arranged with precision. At the very top lay a document stamped in bold letters, Last Will and Testament. Janet's eyes hardened as she slid it toward herself. The lockbox sat open on the dining table, its sharp scent of paper and metal mixing with the faint aroma of the tea Janet had left untouched earlier. Shadows from the overhead lamp stretched across the oak surface, framing the folders stacked with decades of her care and planning. Olivia leaned closer, her breath shallow. She had never seen her grandmother this way before. Eyes narrowed, movements deliberate. Like a woman preparing for a war no one else believed she would fight. Janet pulled out the manila envelope labeled in her careful handwriting. Will. The paper rasped softly as she slid it free, the weight of it heavier than she remembered. She unfolded the crisp pages, and her eyes went straight to the section that mattered. Her son's name appeared in clean type. Eric Collins, sole heir to the estate. Her stomach tightened. The words were supposed to represent trust, continuity, family. Instead, they looked like a trap she herself had built. She exhaled slowly through her nose, her hands steady, but her pulse racing. David had believed in their son. They both had. Back when Eric was still promising and eager, when he hadn't yet calcified into the cold man who now controlled access to his own father's grave. Janet swallowed the lump in her throat. The page blurred for a second before she blinked it clear again. Beside her, Olivia scanned the lines, her expression darkening. He doesn't deserve it. The words were sharp, more certain than Janet had expected from someone so young. They landed with the finality of a gavel. Janet's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned back to the will, her hand drifting toward the pen lying on the table. Not after this, she said, each syllable deliberate. She uncapped the pen with a sharp click. The sound echoed in the quiet room, as if announcing a verdict. Leaning over the document, she drew a thick circle around Eric's name. The red ink seeped into the fibers of the paper, bright and violent against the black print. It looked less like an edit and more like a wound. Olivia watched silently, her fingers curled against the edge of the table. When Janet finally leaned back, the girl asked in a steady voice, "What will you do?" Janet didn't answer right away. She studied the circle, her gaze fixed as though she were staring not at letters on a page, but at Eric himself. Memories surged, his cold refusal at the door, his indifference to her grief, the sharp command in his voice. Her shoulders squared, and when she spoke, it carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime making hard decisions. Erase him. Olivia's breath caught, then she nodded. No argument, no hesitation. In her eyes was something that startled Janet, not just loyalty, but pride. The air in the dining room seemed to change, the silence now taut with momentum. For decades, Janet had been careful, restrained, the one who smoothed rough edges. Tonight she wasn't smoothing anything. Tonight she was sharpening. She gathered the rest of the documents, stacked them neatly back into the box, and set the will aside. Its presence on the table felt like an open wound demanding immediate treatment. Her gaze slid to the phone on the counter. The decision came without hesitation now, like muscle memory. She rose, crossed the room, and picked it up. The dial tone hummed in her ear as she pressed the numbers. Her pulse matched its steady rhythm. When the line clicked and a calm male voice answered, she said, "This is Janet Collins. I need to make changes to my will." Urgently, there was a pause. Then the voice replied with measured calm, "Mrs. Collins, this is Harvey Klein. Tell me what happened." Janet glanced at Olivia, who gave her the faintest of nods, a signal of shared resolve. Her grip on the receiver tightened. "I want my son removed." Completely. The red ink on the page glared back at her from the table, bright and merciless. For the first time in months, Janet felt control sliding back into her own hands. The morning air in Columbus was brisk, carrying the faint bite of autumn. Janet parked her old sedan outside a strip plaza. Its brick facade, lined with small businesses, an optometrist, a tax prep office, and tucked in the corner, Harvey Klein, attorney at law. The office door chimed softly when she pushed it open. Inside smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee, a contrast to the fluorescent hum outside in the plaza. The space was compact but sharp, every file stacked neatly, every surface polished. It wasn't the grandeur of a downtown firm, but it was precise. And Janet respected precision. Behind a tidy oak desk, Harvey Klein looked up from his computer. His dark suit was clean but not flashy, his wire-frame glasses catching the light. He had the calm, patient presence of someone who had spent decades guiding people through hard decisions without flinching. "Mrs. Collins," he said, rising with a steady hand extended. "I understand you'd like to make some changes." Janet shook his hand firmly, sliding into the leather chair across from him. The weight of the folder in her lap felt heavier than it should. She laid it on the desk, opened it, and pushed her will across to him. Harvey adjusted his glasses, scanned the pages quickly, then glanced back at her. "You want him gone entirely?" Her gaze was steady, unblinking. Every line, every dollar, the air in the room shifted with the certainty of her words. For a moment, only the soft whir of Harvey's computer fan filled the silence. He studied her, perhaps gauging if grief was clouding judgment, but all he found was clarity. "You understand," Harvey said slowly. "This means your son will have no standing. We'll name an alternate beneficiary." "Yes," Janet said, her voice low but firm. She turned her head toward the chair beside her, where Olivia sat upright, hands folded in her lap, her expression protective but calm. "Olivia will inherit everything." The girl's eyes flickered with surprise, then softened with gratitude. She reached under the desk to squeeze her grandmother's hand. Janet didn't look down, but her fingers curled back with equal strength. Harvey nodded once, sliding the will aside and pulling a yellow legal pad from his drawer. He wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the paper, the sound crisp and decisive. "We'll also add a no contest clause," he said. Janet tilted her head. "Explain." "If Eric tries to fight this," Harvey replied, "he risks forfeiting even the smallest token you might leave him. It discourages heirs from stirring trouble. In your case, since you're leaving him nothing, the clause ensures he can't drag Olivia into court without consequence. The judge will dismiss him before he gets far." Janet's lips curved into the faintest smile, though there was no humor in it. "Perfect. He'll get nothing." She spoke the words slowly, savoring them. For once, nothing was not emptiness. It was justice. Harvey gathered the old will, slid it into a separate envelope, and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he pulled a fresh document from his printer tray. "We'll draft this clean. No ambiguity, no loopholes." Olivia leaned closer to her grandmother, whispering, "He won't see this coming." Janet turned her head, her eyes glinting. "That's the point." The process was meticulous but steady. Janet initialed, signed, and confirmed each line Harvey read aloud. Each stroke of her pen felt like a chisel, carving Eric's claim out of stone. When it was done, Harvey gathered the signed pages and slipped them into a slim folder, stamping it with his office seal. "I'll place the originals in a safe deposit box downtown. Copies for you here," he said, sliding a crisp packet across the desk. Janet exhaled, the breath long and heavy, as though she had been holding it for months. "That," she said softly, "is the grave I dug." Harvey didn't smile, but he gave a small, respectful nod. "Sometimes, Mrs. Collins, cutting ties is the kindest thing you can do for yourself." Janet stood, smoothing her jacket, a strange calm settling in her chest. Olivia followed, her arm brushing against her grandmother's as they stepped back into the cool air outside. The strip plaza buzzed faintly with traffic from the main road, but Janet hardly heard it. She felt lighter, unburdened, but also sharpened, as though her edges had finally been returned to her. She slid into the driver's seat of her car, gripping the steering wheel, ready to head home. That's when her phone buzzed inside her purse. She pulled it free and glanced at the screen. A voicemail notification blinked red. The number was familiar, Monica's. Janet pressed play. Monica's voice slithered through the speaker, brittle but biting. "Don't drain our future, Janet." The message cut off, leaving only static. Janet lowered the phone, her jaw tightening. For the first time she smiled, not with warmth, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who had already chosen her battlefield. The silence in Harvey Klein's office was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the printer as it spat out the clean draft of her new will. Janet sat straighter than she had in years, the weight of 70 years in her spine, but a sharpness in her eyes that belied every wrinkle. Harvey slid the papers toward her across the polished oak desk. His voice was calm, precise, the way surgeons might sound before cutting. "Review each page carefully, Mrs. Collins. Sign where I've marked. Once these are filed, they are final." Janet adjusted her reading glasses and let her eyes sweep across the text. The clean lines, the airtight clauses. There was no trace of Eric's name anywhere. Instead, Olivia was named the sole heir. A young woman who had chosen kindness when her parents had chosen cruelty. Beside her, Olivia leaned closer, the excitement in her face softened by the weight of what this meant. "Grandma," she whispered, "this changes everything." Janet nodded but didn't reply. Her gaze lingered on the section near the bottom, an allocation of 10% of her estate to a senior advocacy group downtown. That had been her own addition, a safeguard for others like her, whose voices were often dismissed by the people meant to protect them. Eric had tried to silence her grief. In return, she would leave a legacy that shouted for the voiceless. She lifted the pen. The moment felt almost ceremonial. She pressed the tip to the page and signed. Janet Collins. The ink curved in familiar strokes, but this time it carried a weight it never had before. Harvey guided her through the rest. Page after page, initials where required, signatures where demanded. Each mark felt less like paperwork and more like an incision, cutting Eric out of the bloodline of her estate. When the last page was complete, Janet set the pen down with finality. A strange calm washed over her. Not joy, not even relief, something steadier, something like justice. Harvey stacked the signed pages, slipped them into a protective sleeve, and stamped them with his office seal. "These will go to a safe deposit box today. Your copy stays with you. With the no contest clause in place, Eric will have no standing to challenge it." Janet breathed out, long and controlled, as if releasing months of pent-up air. "That's the grave I dug," she said, her voice quiet but unflinching. Olivia reached for her grandmother's hand under the desk, squeezing tightly. "He can't hurt you anymore," Janet squeezed back. "No, not anymore." Harvey closed his briefcase with a decisive click. "You've done the hard part, Mrs. Collins. Now the law does the rest." The three of them rose. Janet adjusted her coat, feeling lighter than when she had walked in. She wasn't naive. She knew Eric wouldn't accept this quietly. But now the law was her shield, and she no longer feared his threats. Olivia held the door open, the hallway outside faintly scented of coffee and copier toner. Together they stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds, and for the first time in months, Janet noticed the warmth of the sun on her face. At the curb, she paused. Her heart beat steady, her mind clear. She had buried her husband with dignity. Today she had buried her son's entitlement with the same ceremony. Back in her car, she rested her purse in the passenger seat and reached for her debit card wallet. She wanted to stop at the florist, fresh lilies and marigolds for David's grave, to replace the wilted bouquet she had laid days earlier. The shop bell jingled as she stepped inside, the air cool and sweet with the scent of roses, carnations, and soil. She picked the flowers carefully, imagining them nestled at the foot of David's headstone. At the counter, Janet slipped her debit card into the reader. The machine chirped, then beeped, declined. She frowned, tried again, declined. The clerk gave her an apologetic smile. Maybe try another card? Janet pulled out a $20 bill from her wallet instead, sliding it across the counter without a word. She took the bouquet in her arms, but her mind was no longer on the flowers. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She walked back to her car with the bouquet cradled against her chest, the stems damp against her palm, her gut twisted with unease. For a brief moment, she considered checking her phone. Then she stopped, tightened her grip on the flowers, and told herself one thing. Whatever had just happened, she would find out. And this time, she would not let it pass. The florist's perfume still clung to her coat as Janet sat behind the wheel, staring at the glow of her phone. The transaction line was stark and merciless. Transfer, $4,000. User, Eric Collins. For a long moment, she didn't breathe. The numbers didn't feel real, yet the pit in her stomach knew better. He hadn't just refused her grief. He had reached into her pocket, plundered the savings she had guarded since David's illness. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. She drove home on autopilot, headlights cutting through the dusk, every street lamp flashing across her windshield like a metronome, counting down to confrontation. Inside the house, she placed the bouquet gently on the counter, as if it were fragile, though her own body thrummed with rage. She moved straight to her desk, booted up her laptop, and signed into her bank account. The blue-white light washed over her lined face, exposing every tremor of fury. The record was there, Eric's secondary login, his name attached to the theft in black and white. $4,000 transferred out in one sweep. Her hand shook, but not from fear, from clarity. Behind her, Olivia's voice startled the quiet. "Grandma, what's wrong?" Janet turned the screen toward her. "He took it." $4,000. Olivia stepped closer, eyes widening. "From you? With his login?" Janet nodded, her voice flat, stripped of shock. He didn't even bother hiding it. For a moment, the girl stood frozen. Then her expression hardened. Her jaw set in the way David's had when he'd refused to let injustice slide. "Dad's showing his true face." Janet reached for her notebook, the one she had always used for neat lists and family budgets. She flipped to a blank page, wrote the date at the top, and beneath it, in crisp letters, evidence. She jotted down the transaction number, the dollar amount, the login credentials attached. Her handwriting was steady, precise. "I'm documenting every wrinkle," she murmured. The next morning, Janet and Olivia walked into the bank. The lobby buzzed faintly with fluorescent lights and the shuffle of customers, but Janet moved with calm precision. A manager ushered them into a glass-walled office, the faint scent of carpet cleaner and coffee hanging in the air. She slid the printed statements across the desk. "That transfer," she said, her voice sharp as glass. "It wasn't me." The manager frowned, adjusted his tie, and pulled up her file on his monitor. His fingers clattered against the keyboard before he looked back at her. "You're right, Mrs. Collins. Secondary login." Eric Collins. Janet's lips pressed tight. "Then freeze every account." Effective immediately, he hesitated, All accounts. All, she repeated, her tone leaving no space for doubt. Within minutes, he clicked the final keystrokes. Your funds are secure now. No further access without your personal authorization. Outside, the autumn wind whipped against Janet's cheeks, cool and bracing. She held the packet of bank records like a weapon, not fragile paper. Each line of text was a blade she could wield. That afternoon, Harvey Klein looked over the records in his tidy office. His calm composure never faltered, though his jaw tightened as he scanned Eric's name. This isn't just unethical, he said. This is elder financial exploitation. It's prosecutable. Janet sat forward, her eyes sharp. Then prosecute it. Harvey nodded, already pulling forms from a drawer. He typed swiftly, the keys clacking as he assembled the fraud report, attaching the evidence with meticulous care. His movements were surgical, precise, each page stamped and signed until the packet was complete. This will move quickly, he said at last. Eric will be served within days. Olivia watched quietly, her hand resting on Janet's arm. He won't be able to hide from this. Janet met her granddaughter's gaze, her voice calm and cutting. He can't hide from who he is. For the rest of the evening, the house was quieter than usual, but not the suffocating quiet of grief. This silence pulsed with waiting, like a drumbeat before battle. Janet ate dinner without haste, washed her plate, and placed the evidence folder neatly beside her purse. 2 mornings later, the sound of tires crunching gravel outside pulled her from her gardening. She rose from her knees, dirt on her gloves, as a sheriff's cruiser rolled to the curb. The deputy stepped out, tall and deliberate, the metallic glint of his badge catching the morning sun. Mrs. Collins, he asked politely. Yes, she answered, wiping soil from her hands onto her jeans. He pulled a folded document from his satchel. I'm here to serve Eric Collins with a fraud summons. Janet accepted the papers, the thick envelope solid in her grip. Across the street, a neighbor's wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, but to Janet, the only sound was the echo of justice being set in motion. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The paper in her hand spoke louder than any grin. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor wax and paper, its hallways echoing with footsteps and murmurs. Janet walked with Olivia on one side and Harvey on the other. Her file of evidence clutched tight against her chest. She had never imagined being here because of her own son. But then again, she had never imagined he'd steal from her either. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The judge sat high on the bench, robe hanging loose, his eyes scanning the docket. Eric sat at the defense table in a pressed shirt and blazer, his hair slicked back as though appearances alone might cleanse him. Monica sat behind him, arms crossed, her expression tight and watchful. When Janet entered, Eric's eyes flicked toward her, then away. No remorse, no shame, just calculation. All rise, the bailiff announced. Everyone stood. The judge, a man with deep lines around his mouth, looked over the file before him. Case of Collins versus State of Ohio, elder financial exploitation. Janet's stomach twisted at the sound of those words, elder, exploitation, her name tied to betrayal by blood. Eric rose, his voice polished, rehearsed. Your Honor, this is a family misunderstanding. I was helping my mother manage her accounts. There was confusion about the transfer. Nothing more. His tone dripped with practiced sincerity, as though the theft of $4,000 were an innocent hiccup. Monica nodded subtly. Her lips pursed, like she was backing the lie with silent applause. Janet sat straighter, her chin lifted. Harvey placed a reassuring hand on her arm before rising to address the court. His voice was calm, unhurried, but precise, every word cutting like glass. With respect, Your Honor, what we have here is not confusion. It is elder exploitation, plain and simple. He held up the file Janet had carried. We have bank statements showing the withdrawal. We have electronic records confirming the login came from Eric Collins. And we have Mrs. Collins herself, competent, lucid, testifying she did not authorize this transfer. The judge leaned forward, brows knitted. "Show me." Harvey stepped to the bench, sliding copies of the statements across. The judge examined them, flipping page after page. His frown deepened. "Mr. Collins," the judge said, his voice heavy, "these records show the money left your mother's account directly under your credentials. How do you explain that?" Eric's confident veneer cracked, just slightly, his jaw tensed, but he forced a laugh. "My mother, she must have forgotten. She asked me to move funds before. She's not as—" Janet slammed her palms softly but firmly against the table. The sound startled even herself. Her voice carried through the courtroom, clear and unwavering. "I didn't forget. I didn't ask you. You stole from me for a moment." The silence in the room was absolute. The judge's gaze sharpened. "Enough," he said, his voice curt. "The evidence speaks louder than excuses. Restitution will be paid in full, Mr. Collins. This court will not tolerate the exploitation of vulnerable citizens, least of all by their own family." Eric's face flushed red, his jaw twitching. Monica grabbed her purse and stood abruptly, heels clicking furiously on the marble as she stormed out, muttering under her breath. Her exit turned heads, whispers rippling across the benches. Harvey sat down, calm as ever. Olivia reached for her grandmother's hand, squeezing gently, her touch warm and steady. Janet closed her fingers around her granddaughter's, letting the contact ground her. For the first time since this war with her son had begun, Janet felt like the truth had finally spoken louder than Eric's arrogance. But as the bailiff called the next case and the judge rose to exit, Eric leaned close across the aisle, his voice a low hiss only she could hear. "You'll regret cutting me out," he whispered, venom curling through each syllable. Janet met his eyes. For a moment, she saw the boy he once was. Then it vanished, replaced by the man he had chosen to become. She didn't flinch, but her hand on Olivia's tightened because she knew this fight was far from over. The courthouse air was colder this time, sharper, as if even the walls were bracing for another round. Janet sat at the petitioner's table, her back straight, her folder of evidence placed neatly in front of her. Beside her, Harvey Klein shuffled papers with calm precision, while Olivia sat just behind, her hand resting on Janet's shoulder like an anchor. Across the aisle, Eric leaned forward in his chair, his jaw tense, Monica whispering frantically in his ear. Their attorney, a slick man in a navy suit, rose and cleared his throat, his voice carrying a manufactured sympathy. "Your Honor, my client contends that Mrs. Collins was unduly influenced in rewriting her will. At her age, she is vulnerable. We believe her granddaughter, Olivia Collins, persuaded her to cut her son out unfairly." The words landed like blows, but Janet didn't flinch. She had expected this. Eric had always blamed others when his choices caught up to him. Why should today be any different? The judge, a middle-aged woman with silver hair pinned in a tight bun, adjusted her glasses and glanced at Janet. "Mrs. Collins, do you understand what's being alleged here?" Janet nodded. "I do." "And it's false." Her voice was clear, steady. Harvey rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, we anticipated this claim. To suggest Mrs. Collins lacks competency is baseless. We submit into evidence a medical evaluation performed last month by her physician. It confirms she is fully competent, lucid, and capable of making independent decisions." He handed the sealed letter to the bailiff, who carried it up to the bench. The judge read silently, her expression unreadable, before setting it down. Duly noted, Harvey didn't sit. Instead, he pulled out a small device, setting it on the table. "Additionally, we have an audio recording. Mrs. Collins's son, my client's heir, Eric Collins, explicitly denies his mother access to her husband's grave. The recording was taken by Olivia Collins on the night in question." The judge's brows arched slightly. "Play it." A click. Then the tinny sound of Eric's voice filled the courtroom. "No, Mom." "You're not going," the words echoed against the paneled walls, unmistakable. Janet closed her eyes briefly as the memory surged back. Standing at the doorway, the car pulling away, her husband's grave shut off from her. When she opened her eyes again, Eric's face was pale with fury. The judge leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Eric. "Mr. Collins, do you dispute this is your voice?" Eric shifted, tugged at his tie, then forced a smirk. "Families argue. That doesn't mean my mother wasn't manipulated later." But the smirk didn't land. The recording lingered in the air like a stain. Harvey clasped his hands lightly on the table. "Your Honor, this is not the voice of a man protecting his mother. This is the voice of control, of denial, coupled with the fraudulent transfer already before the court. The picture is clear. Eric Collins seeks not to protect his mother, but to control and exploit her." The judge's face hardened. She lifted the file in front of her, then let it fall shut with a decisive thud. "This appeal is without merit. It is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Collins, you will not waste this court's time with further challenges to your mother's will." Janet felt her chest loosen, as though an iron band had finally snapped. She glanced at Olivia, who smiled softly, relief spilling across her features. Eric, however, stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. His lawyer tried to tug him back down, but he shook him off, muttering under his breath. Monica tugged at his sleeve, her face blotched red, but he stormed out of the courtroom before the judge could dismiss anyone. For a moment, the room exhaled. Janet sat back, letting the air fill her lungs again. "He can't rewrite this," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Harvey gave a single nod. "The law has spoken." They gathered their papers, the victory clean but sobering. Families weren't supposed to be decided in courtrooms. Yet here they were. Janet tucked the documents into her bag, her hand steady, her resolve firmer than ever. As they stepped into the cool corridor, Janet's phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it free, expecting Olivia's friend or perhaps Harvey's office line. Instead, the caller ID read Dispatch Journal. She frowned, answered. "Hello?" A woman's voice, brisk but warm, came through the line. "Mrs. Collins, this is Rachel Doyle with the Columbus Dispatch. We've been following your case. Would you be willing to share your story?" Janet paused mid-step. The courthouse doors swung shut behind her, muffling the city noise outside. Olivia turned, eyes wide. For the first time in weeks, Janet felt the weight shift again. Her story had lived in shadows, whispered in kitchens, and fought in courtrooms. Now the world wanted to hear it. The newspaper landed on Janet's porch with a thud that morning, louder than usual, as if the weight of the ink itself demanded to be noticed. She bent slowly, lifting the folded dispatch into her hands. The headline screamed across the front page, "Widow fights back against family greed." Her throat tightened. Beneath the headline was a photo, herself and Olivia standing at David's grave. The lilies she had placed days before leaned gently against the stone, petals luminous under a gray sky. Olivia's arm was looped through hers, their faces resolute, not broken. Janet traced the edges of the photo with her thumb, the paper coarse beneath her skin. She had never imagined her private grief would become public testimony. Yet here it was, stamped across the city in black and white truth. At the kitchen table, Olivia leaned in, reading aloud from the opening lines. 70-year-old widow Janet Collins has faced what no parent should betrayal by her only son. After being denied access to her husband's grave and suffering financial exploitation, Collins fought back, rewriting her will and taking her case to court. Her voice wavered with both pride and anger. "They told your story, Grandma." Not his. The phone buzzed before Janet could reply. A neighbor, then another. One offered quiet solidarity. Another admitted they'd suspected Eric's arrogance for years. Each call layered onto the next, voices of the community knitting around her like armor. By mid-afternoon, the ripple had spread farther. At the grocery store, whispers followed her down the aisle. That's her, someone muttered. The widow who stood up to her son. Heads tilted, some in admiration, some in pity. Janet walked with her chin high, the headline folded neatly in her purse like a shield. Eric, however, wasn't weathering the storm. Word traveled quickly through Columbus's tight professional networks. His colleagues murmured. His manager called him in. By Friday, he was on leave, pending review. A man who had strutted through life convinced of his own invulnerability now found doors closing in his face. Monica fared no better. The social circles she craved so dearly grew silent. Invitations dwindled. Friends excused themselves when she entered the cafe. She retreated behind tinted car windows and locked doors, but gossip traveled faster than glass could contain. Janet watched it unfold, not with glee, but with a steady, measured satisfaction. She had not sought to humiliate her son. She had sought truth. But truth has a way of cutting deeper than vengeance when it's finally spoken aloud. That evening, Olivia sat across from her at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Everyone's sharing the article. Even people I don't know are commenting. They're calling you brave. Janet sipped her tea, the steam warming her face. He wanted silence, she said softly. I gave him an audience. The house was quiet after Olivia went upstairs, but not the suffocating quiet of before. This quiet hummed with a strange new energy, vindication. Janet folded the paper one last time, sliding it into a drawer. Not as a trophy, but as proof. She had taken back her voice. The knock came just past 9. It was hard, deliberate, rattling the frame of the front door. Janet froze, her hand halfway to the light switch. Through the glass pane, she saw a shadow shift, tall, tense, unmistakable. She opened the door to find Eric standing on her porch. His face was flushed, eyes wild, tie loosened as though he had ripped it off in the car. The cool night air swirled around him, carrying the bitter tang of his cologne mixed with sweat. He didn't wait for her to speak. His words cut through the darkness, sharp and furious. How could you do this to me? The porch light buzzed above them, insects flitting in frantic circles. Janet stood her ground, her body still, her face unreadable. Eric stepped closer, his voice rising. You've ruined me, my job, my reputation. Do you even care? Behind her, the house was silent, but Janet felt Olivia's presence upstairs, alert, listening. She didn't answer him yet. The storm he carried on his tongue was only beginning, and she knew whatever came next would decide how far he was willing to go. The porch light buzzed above them, catching in Eric's wild eyes. His chest heaved, his fists tight at his sides, but then, almost suddenly, his voice faltered. Mom, he said, softer now, the word breaking on his tongue. I was wrong. Please forgive me. The shift was jarring. Janet had braced herself for more venom, not this sudden turn. She stared at him, her grip still steady on the doorframe. For a heartbeat, she saw flashes of the boy who once trailed David around the yard, asking endless questions about tools and engines. But the memory was fragile, already poisoned by the man before her. Her voice cut through the night, calm and unsparing. You denied me my husband's grave. Eric flinched as though the sentence itself were a slap. I didn't mean it like that, he stammered. I was protecting you from yourself, from the grief. And Olivia. Footsteps clicked across the walkway. Monica emerged from the shadows, her posture stiff, but her voice coated in false reason. We were protecting Olivia, she said firmly, as though that settled it. We thought it was better for her not to be dragged into... The creak of the staircase behind Janet interrupted her. Olivia stepped into the doorway, arms folded, her expression lit by both the porch glow and the fire in her eyes. Protecting me, she repeated, her tone sharp. Protecting me from my grandmother. Number. You were protecting yourselves. Her words struck harder than Janet's had. Monica's face faltered, her mouth opening but no words forming. Eric's shoulders hunched, the defiance bleeding out of him. Janet looked from one to the other, then back at her son. "There's no space for you in my will." The words hung in the cool air, final and immovable. Eric's face crumbled. His lips parted as if to argue, but no sound came. The bravado, the arrogance, all of it drained, leaving a man who looked small, stripped of power. For a fleeting second, his eyes glistened, and his jaw trembled. "Mom," he whispered, the plea raw now, "don't do this to me." "I already have," she said simply. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets. Then, like a storm breaking through fragile calm, Eric's rage surged back. His face hardened, his voice dropping low, sharp enough to cut. "You'll regret this," he spat. His eyes flicked to Olivia. "Both of you will. You think you can humiliate me, cut me out? This isn't over." He turned on his heel, storming down the walkway, his shoes grinding against the concrete. Monica scrambled after him, her heels clattering in the dark, her face pale and twisted. The slam of their car doors echoed through the quiet street, followed by the roar of the engine as they sped off. Janet closed the door slowly, the latch clicking with finality. The house fell silent again, but this silence was different. It carried the weight of a threat, thick and lingering. Olivia placed her hand gently on her grandmother's arm. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Outside, the night returned to its rhythm, but both knew the storm Eric had promised was gathering, and it would come sooner than they expected. The first shot came at sunrise. Monica's post slid across Facebook like a slick press release, polished yet sour beneath the shine. A photo of her and Eric smiling at a wine-tasting event, their arms looped tight, followed by a long caption. "Our family is hurting. Eric's mother has been misled and manipulated. She's turned Olivia against us. We only wanted to protect our daughter from grief, but now Janet has twisted our intentions into punishment. Please respect our privacy while we deal with this smear campaign." The likes and comments piled up quickly. "Stay strong, sending love. So unfair." Little, red hearts bloomed beneath the lies, dozens of voices rushing to console the very people who had left Janet to mourn alone. At her kitchen table, Janet scrolled silently. The oatmeal in her bowl had gone cold, untouched. The early light filtered through lace curtains, painting her face in soft gold. Olivia hovered near her shoulder, restless, her arms folded tight. "They're burying us in pity," Olivia said, her voice sharp. "They make it sound like you're the villain." Janet set the phone down, her jaw tightening. "Then we won't argue," she said. "We'll show them." From the drawer, she drew out Harvey's packet. Neat, labeled, official, bank records, court summons, restitution orders, stamped and signed. She smoothed the pages on the table, their edges catching the morning light. The paper smelled faintly of toner, of permanence. "Help me take photographs," she said. Olivia cleared a space near the window where the light was brightest. She flattened each page, her fingers pressing the corners flat. Janet's hands remained steady as she held them in place, and Olivia snapped the photos, click, click, checking each one for clarity. "No speeches," Janet murmured. "No dramatics." Just the facts on her modest Facebook page, more used to book club reminders and gardening notes. Janet uploaded the images one by one. The caption she typed was short: "Public records for anyone who wants the truth." For a while, the post sat quiet. Then the first comment appeared. "This is terrible." The next came faster. "Wait, that's his login." Another. "Eric stole from his mom? Judge ordered restitution?" And then, "Why didn't Monica mention this?" The thread grew teeth. Strangers linked the newspaper article. Former neighbors added stories. Even an old coworker chimed in. Eric always thought rules didn't apply to him. Within hours, Monica's post began to wobble. Hearts and prayers gave way to pointed questions. Someone pasted Janet's screenshots beneath Monica's glossy photo. Another asked bluntly, "If this is a smear, why does the judge's order say otherwise?" By early afternoon, Monica deleted her entire post. Olivia leaned against the counter, exhaling hard. "They can't hide anymore." Janet rinsed her coffee mug, the warm water fogging the glass. "And I'm not hiding either," she said. Her voice wasn't triumphant, only steady, like someone who had finally grown tired of silence. That evening, the neighborhood itself seemed different. Mrs. Patterson from across the street knocked on the door with a casserole and a firm squeeze of Janet's hand. At the grocery store, two people stopped to say they'd read the story and admired her courage. Not pity, not whispers. Respect. But the quiet wasn't entirely comforting. Around dusk, the mail carrier delivered a thick, certified envelope, his voice brisk at the door. "Needs your signature, ma'am." Janet scrawled her name on the form, the pen scratching against the stiff paper. Inside, the envelope was heavy, official. She slid a butter knife under the flap and pulled out the notice stamped with the court seal. Order of garnishment, restitution, enforcement. Eric's wages would be garnished until every cent of the $4,000, plus fees, was repaid. The seal's embossed edge caught under her fingertip, sharp and undeniable. Olivia read over her shoulder, her voice low but awed. "It's real. He's trapped now." Janet folded the document neatly, placing it on the evidence stack. "It's justice," she said. But justice never arrives quietly. Just past 9, the rumble of an SUV rolled down the block. Janet glanced through the curtain, the headlights cut off as it idled at the curb. A shadowed figure climbed out, moving with deliberate steps up the walkway. The doorbell rang once, sharp. Olivia froze near the stairs. Janet drew in a steady breath, her eyes narrowing as the porch light flicked on. Eric's silhouette filled the glass pane of the door. He wasn't smiling this time. The morning after Eric's looming silhouette had filled her porch, Janet woke with the same thought burning in her chest. If he could steal from her bank account, if he could spin lies into sympathy, he could just as easily circle back for the one thing she hadn't yet fortified. The house. She stood in the living room, letting her eyes drift across the space. The faint smell of last night's fire lingered in the hearth. Photos lined the mantel, David smiling with his arm around her. Olivia's grade school graduation. Family cookouts when the world had still felt whole. This wasn't just property. It was the anchor of her life, and Eric would not make it his trophy. At Harvey Klein's office that afternoon, she slid into the leather chair across from his desk. He was already waiting with a new stack of forms, the edges crisp, the language airtight. His expression was calm, but the way he pushed his glasses higher on his nose told her he understood the urgency. "We're moving the deed into an irrevocable trust," Harvey explained. His voice was measured, the hum of the fluorescent light above giving it a steady rhythm. "Once this is complete, neither Eric nor Monica can contest ownership. They can't force a sale. They can't use it for leverage. It belongs to the trust, with Olivia as beneficiary." Janet smoothed the fabric of her skirt, her hand steady. "And once it's in, there's no pulling it back out." "Correct, not even you," Harvey said. "That's what makes it impenetrable." She looked at Olivia, who sat beside her, eyes bright with both worry and admiration. "Grandma, you're ironclad now," she said softly, almost like a vow. Janet allowed herself the faintest smile. "And they're cut off." The words left her mouth like steel, cold and certain. She signed where Harvey indicated, each stroke of her pen carving away Eric's imagined future. When she finished, Harvey gathered the deed, stamped it with a firm motion, and slid a notarized copy across the desk toward her. "This one's yours," he said. "Frame it if you want." A reminder, and she did. Back home, Janet cleared a space on the wall of her living room. She slipped the copy into a walnut frame David had built years ago for family photos, pressing the glass tight against the paper until it gleamed under the afternoon sun. She hung it above the mantel, straight and proud. When she stepped back, something inside her shifted. For the first time since David's death, her smile came without effort. It was small, yes, but real, the kind that tugged at her cheeks instead of her throat. That evening, Olivia caught her staring at it. "You look lighter," she said gently. "I am," Janet replied. "For the first time in months, I feel like I'm not just surviving. I'm protecting what matters." They sat together on the couch, the framed deed glowing faintly in the lamplight, as though the house itself exhaled with them. But peace never lasted long. The next morning, while Janet watered her garden, Olivia's phone buzzed on the porch rail. She glanced at the screen, her face stiffening. "Grandma," she called. "It's Dad's company." Janet turned, wiping soil from her gloves. Olivia read the message aloud. "Due to recent developments, Eric Collins is no longer employed with this firm. Please redirect any future correspondence accordingly." The words hung between them like church bells. Loud. Irrevocable. Janet's eyes narrowed, not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of consequence. She looked back at the house, the deed framed in her living room, the flowers blooming at her feet. Eric had been cut off from her legacy. Now, the world was cutting him off from his livelihood. And she knew this new wound would drive him back to her door. Rain streaked the windows in silver threads, the storm outside rattling the gutters. Janet opened the door to find Eric and Monica standing on the porch, both looking smaller than she'd ever seen them. Eric's shirt was wrinkled, his collar stained. Monica's mascara ran in faint rivers down her cheeks, her once perfect hair flattened by the drizzle. They had always arrived in confidence before, SUV gleaming, clothes pressed, voices sharp. Now they stood like strangers in a borrowed tragedy. "Mom," Eric started, his voice low and raw. "We need your help." Janet leaned against the doorframe, her face unreadable. The scent of rain clung to them, mixed with desperation that seemed almost tangible. She waited, saying nothing. Eric shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've lost my job. They said the publicity." He broke off, glancing at Monica. Monica stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Please, Janet, we have nothing left. Bills are piling. Eric's checks are gone. We need you." Her voice cracked, and the sob that followed wasn't staged. It was the sound of someone who had lost control of the life she had built on appearances. Janet's eyes flicked to Monica's damp shoes, to the faint run in her stocking. For years, this woman had sneered in her kitchen, dismissing her grief as too much for Olivia to bear. Now she stood shaking on her porch, stripped of all that armor. "You told me I couldn't grieve," Janet said, her tone soft but steady, her eyes locked on Eric's. "Now you can't inherit." Eric's lips parted, shock flashing across his face. "Mom, you don't mean that." Monica interrupted, stepping closer, her tears streaking freely. "Please, we have nothing." Janet's voice didn't waver. "Exactly what you gave me." Behind her, Olivia's footsteps creaked on the stairs. She came to stand beside her grandmother, her presence solid, protective. Her gaze on her parents was sharp with betrayal. "And exactly what you deserve," Olivia added. For a long moment, the storm filled the silence. The rain pounded harder, drumming against the porch roof, washing away what little dignity Eric and Monica still carried. Eric's shoulders slumped. His jaw tightened, but his eyes revealed a hollow kind of defeat. Monica covered her face with both hands, her sobs muffled, her body shaking. Janet straightened her back, her hand firm on the door. "Good night." And with one smooth motion, she shut them out. The latch clicked, sealing the boundary between her world and theirs. She turned toward Olivia, whose face was pale but resolved. Together they stood for a moment in the quiet hum of the house, listening as the storm outside swallowed Eric and Monica's fading voices. Neither spoke, neither needed to. The silence was not heavy this time. It was clean, final. Later that week, the rain cleared. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and maple leaves. Janet returned from the garden to find a plain envelope waiting in her mailbox. No return address, no markings, just her name written in Eric's unmistakable scrawl. She held it in her hand for a moment, the paper limp from the damp air. Olivia stepped onto the porch behind her. "From him?" she asked. Janet nodded once. Her thumb traced the edge of the flap. For a second, the temptation flickered, the urge to peel it open, to know whether it held apology, threat, or one last plea. Then she set it on the entry table, unopened. The silence of the house wrapped around her again, but this time it was hers. The morning light spilled across Janet's garden in soft sheets, catching on petals slick with dew. She knelt by the flower bed, her knees pressing into damp soil, her gloved hands working gently at the roots of her marigolds. The scent of earth clung to her skin, grounding her, reminding her of the work that still lived in her hands. For months, tending the garden had felt like a futile ritual, a way to busy herself against grief and betrayal. Now it felt different. Each weed pulled free, each flower pruned, was an act of reclaiming. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Olivia stepped out, hair pulled back, her face bright with the kind of smile Janet had once feared she'd never see again. She carried 2 mugs of tea, steam curling into the cool autumn air. "Brought you something," Olivia said, setting one mug on the garden wall. Janet wiped her gloves on her apron, lifted the cup, and inhaled. The tea smelled faintly of mint and chamomile. She took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you, sweetheart." They sat together on the low wall, the garden alive around them with bees humming and sparrows darting between branches. For once, no tension pulled at Janet's shoulders. The house was quiet, but not the suffocating quiet of Eric's absence. This was the hush of peace she had built herself. Later that afternoon, the mail arrived in its usual clatter against the box. Janet brought the bundle inside, flipping through bills and advertisements, until her eyes caught on a hand-addressed envelope. The handwriting was uneven, unfamiliar, but neat. She slid it open carefully. Inside was a folded letter on heavy stationery. At the top, in tidy block letters, it read, "Senior Advocacy Scholarship Fund." Janet read aloud, "Dear Mrs. Collins, I'm writing to thank you. Your contribution made it possible for me to attend college this fall. My grandmother raised me, and she always said people like you, who choose to help strangers, are rare. I'll carry this chance with me because of you." Her voice softened on the last line, and she handed the letter to Olivia, who read it with wide eyes. "Grandma," Olivia whispered, her throat tight. This is incredible." Janet walked to the mantel and set the letter in a small silver frame, placing it beside the framed deed to the house. The paper gleamed under the lamplight, not as decoration, but as proof of what she had chosen to pass on. "This," Janet said, her voice steady, "is my true legacy." Olivia turned, her face shining with conviction. "Not him." This Janet nodded, her eyes fixed on the mantel. "Not him." This, the weeks that followed, settled into a rhythm. Janet baked bread again, filling the kitchen with the smell of yeast and rosemary. She joined her old book club, her laughter carrying through the cafe, where she hadn't dared show her face in months. Olivia visited often, her college applications spread across the dining table, her questions peppered with hope instead of fear. But beneath the peace, the memory of Eric lingered like a shadow at the edge of a bright room. Janet never spoke of it, but some nights she caught herself glancing at the unopened letter on the entry table, the one written in his handwriting. She hadn't thrown it away. She hadn't opened it either. It remained there, silent, waiting. By late November, frost laced the garden, each blade of grass stiff underfoot. Janet pulled her coat tighter as she clipped the last of the season's blooms, her breath clouding in the cold air. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and cloves. Olivia had started baking early for the holidays. A framed letter from a second scholarship student now joined the first on the mantel. Janet touched the glass lightly, her fingertips brushing the words, "Thank you." Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the promise of snow. Winter was here, and through it all, through the months of silence, through the frozen nights, and the letters of gratitude that warmed her home, not a single call had come from Eric. The winter afternoon light slanted through the blinds, pale and thin, striping Janet's desk with silver. The air in the house was still, holding only the faint smell of cinnamon from the bread Olivia had baked that morning. Janet sat in her chair, posture tall, her eyes on the two frames standing side by side, the deed to her home and the copy of her new will. The glass caught the light, throwing back a reflection that looked almost like armor, paper forged into steel. Eric's name was gone, cleanly, permanently. No trace of him in the lines that would outlast her. Her fingers brushed over the wood of the desk. It had been David's once, his space for paying bills, sorting letters, writing the little notes he used to leave tucked into her recipe books. She could almost hear the soft scratch of his pen, the hum he carried when he worked. The memory warmed her instead of breaking her this time. Olivia entered quietly, a folded letter in her hand. "Another thank you," she said, softly. Her smile was small but bright, the kind that always reminded Janet of her younger self. She placed the envelope next to the framed will, the paper crisp against the polished desk. Janet looked up at her granddaughter, at the steadiness in her gaze. "You took your power back, Grandma," Olivia said. Janet nodded slowly. Her voice, when it came, was low but sure. "I gave him what he gave me, nothing." The words didn't come from spite. They came from truth. Eric had shut her out of mourning. He had stolen her money, tried to rewrite her life, twisted her grief into leverage. In the end, she had given him exactly what he'd earned. Nothing. Olivia leaned down. Wrapping her arms around her grandmother's shoulders, Janet returned the embrace, feeling the warmth of youth, of loyalty, of love that hadn't been bought or demanded, but freely given. For a moment, the weight she'd carried for so long slipped away, replaced by something light and certain. When Olivia let go, the two of them stayed there in the quiet house, the only sound the faint ticking of the old wall clock. It was not the silence of abandonment or fear anymore. It was the silence of peace. Janet turned her gaze back to the mantel across the room. The scholarship letters framed there were lined up neatly, each one a different handwriting, each one a story her choice had made possible. Strangers' futures, secured because she had chosen to act, to sever, to give meaning to her loss. She rose from her chair and walked slowly across the living room, her slippers brushing the rug. She stopped in front of the mantel, tracing one fingertip along the edge of a frame. The words inside seemed to glow. "Thank you. You gave me a chance." David would have approved. She knew it as surely as she knew the sound of her own breath. Olivia joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "This is your true legacy," she whispered. Janet smiled, her eyes on the letters, then the framed deed, then the will. Not him, this. The evening settled around them like a soft blanket. Snow had begun to fall outside, flakes catching in the glow of the street lamp, the world hushed by winter's touch. Janet inhaled deeply, her chest rising steady, her breath no longer tight with grief or anger. For months she had carried the weight of betrayal. Tonight, the weight was gone. What remained was clarity and the calm of a decision fully lived. She stepped back to her desk, sat once more, and let her hands rest on the smooth wood. Her gaze lingered on the framed documents, the proof of her choices, her strength, her refusal to be erased. Her voice was quiet but resolute, carrying through the empty room with the force of a lifetime. "My son refused to take me to my husband's grave, so I dug his name out of my will.